I am not a Christian. I do not follow the Christian religion, nor do I believe in the Christian God, simply because I see no reason to. But putting aside the question of whether God exists, I still would not consider myself a Christian even if he did. If God existed as described in the Bible, he would be so morally inadequate that he wouldn't deserve to be worshipped by anyone. His moral failings are so abundant and so extreme, it immediately rules out any possibility that I would ever worship him. I honestly could not bring myself to follow a God so totally unworthy of praise, devotion, or adoration. In many ways, very many, the biblical God is nothing short of a moral disaster, and I've chosen several of the most outrageous examples that clearly illustrate why Christianity is morally unacceptable. These are just a few simple reasons that are so obvious they can be easily understood by anyone with even the most basic grasp of right and wrong. Number 1. The Act of Global Genocide. In the book of Genesis, God decides that all of mankind has become too evil to be allowed to live. He then creates a worldwide flood to destroy the earth, and almost every living thing is killed. One of the most confusing aspects of this story is how literally everyone on earth could be so evil they were all deserving of death. That alone is difficult to believe, and the Bible doesn't explain this in any detail. But even more importantly, how did this situation come about in the first place, and why was global death the only solution? Given that God allegedly knows everything and is capable of anything, it's baffling that he would do nothing to keep mankind from descending into such an irredeemable state. And even if he did allow this to happen, it would have been fully within his power to correct this issue without resorting to total annihilation. But instead, God chose to commit global genocide when it could have been avoided. This decision is deeply troubling and casts serious doubt on the idea that God is praiseworthy. Number 2. The premeditated murder of children. In the book of Exodus, the Israelites are held captive by the Egyptians. God demands that the Pharaoh release the Israelites, but he refuses. In response, God curses Egypt with a series of plagues, and yet the Pharaoh remains unconvinced. Before the final plague, the Pharaoh is once again asked to let the Israelites go. According to Exodus 10, verse 27, the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he was not willing to let them go. For the last plague, God kills all the firstborn children of the Egyptians, and there was not a house without someone dead. Given that God hardened the Pharaoh's heart so that he would refuse to release the Israelites, the killing of the firstborn was actually unnecessary, and yet he intentionally brought about this situation to give himself the opportunity to murder children. Who would want to worship a God like that? Number 3. The failure to condemn slavery. Nowadays, the practice of slavery is universally understood to be wrong. It is plainly unacceptable to own human beings as if they were property, and everyone recognizes this. Except for God. Throughout the entire Bible, there is not a single all-encompassing prohibition of human slavery. Not once is it stated that slavery is always wrong. Instead, the practice of slavery is explicitly permitted. You can buy slaves, you can beat your slaves, you can even punch holes in a slave's ears to mark him as your property. And in the New Testament, slaves are instructed to obey their masters as they would obey Christ. Again, the Bible never expresses any disapproval of slave ownership. God's acceptance and endorsement of human slavery is obviously a glaring moral oversight. It's simply unthinkable that God would fail to understand what even humans know to be wrong, and his support of something so intolerable has grave consequences for his moral credibility. Number 4. The imposition of hereditary guilt. There are a number of instances in the Old Testament where someone's descendants are targeted for punishment because of the sins of their ancestors. Indeed, one of the central doctrines of Christianity is that everyone is considered inherently sinful and in need of forgiveness, all because of the sins of Adam and Eve. Apparently, guilt can be passed on from generation to generation. But what sense does that make? How could you be morally culpable for something you didn't do and were never involved in? What responsibility could you possibly have for something that happened before you even existed? This is one of the most fundamental concepts of justice. There are no grounds for assigning blame to an innocent person. God's refusal to reserve guilt for the guilty party indicates that he either does not comprehend this, or he does not care. And again, his understanding of right and wrong is highly questionable. Number 5. The acceptance of vicarious punishment. Continuing this trend of playing fast and loose with guilt, another central tenet of Christianity is that Jesus was free of sin, and yet he died and was punished for all the sins of humanity. Because of this, we are no longer held accountable for our innate sinfulness, and we can go unpunished since Jesus already suffered the penalty for us. But even if we did accept the notion that we're guilty for the sins of our ancestors, what good does it do to punish someone else instead? The very purpose of justice is to ensure that the guilty are punished and the innocent are not. But if this is disregarded, there is no justice. And when guilt is detached from whether or not you actually did anything wrong, then the concept of guilt means nothing at all. If God finds it acceptable for the innocent to be punished so the guilty can go free, this further demonstrates how little he truly cares about justice. Which leads us to number 6, the sanctioning of infinite punishment. The Christian religion actually requires that we accept the death of Jesus as a substitute for our own sins. If, however, you aren't comfortable with the idea of someone else being punished for something you did wrong, there are consequences for that, namely hell. This is presented as one of our possible destinations after death, a place where we will be punished for our sins forever. It's often described as the worst punishment possible, an unbearable eternal agony. But how could a literally infinite punishment possibly be considered fair? Even if we are guilty from birth, even if we choose to suffer the consequences instead of Jesus, what justice is there in a never-ending punishment? Another essential concept of justice is that penalties should be proportionate to the crime that was committed. In other words, a certain amount of punishment is considered sufficient for the crime in question. But the idea of an infinite punishment implies that no consequence, no matter how severe, will ever be sufficient to satisfy the demands of justice. Even after 1 trillion years of the absolute worst punishment, even after 1 trillion years, this still would not be enough. Indeed, it would never be enough to make up for whatever you did wrong. How can a person do something so bad that even having their transgressions revisited upon them infinite times over is still inadequate? And just what do you have to do to deserve such an extreme penalty? Well, you could be born with inherited sin by no fault of your own, or you might not want someone else to be punished in your place, or, quite understandably by this point, you may not want to follow the Christian religion. Any of these is enough to land you in hell. The absurdity of this infinite punishment is only magnified when it's imposed for the most trivial of crimes, that is, assuming these even qualify as crimes. A God who would dictate such a disproportionate punishment, or even passively allow it to take place without interfering, does not deserve to be worshipped. Any of these reasons alone would be enough to call God's moral virtue into question. Together they reveal a God who is not merely imperfect, not simply immoral, but evil beyond belief. This torturer, this child killer, this genocidal tyrant is far more worthy of condemnation than veneration. The monstrous extent of his injustice is appalling by any measure. So ask yourself, is this the kind of God that you'd like to worship? And whether or not he does exist, would you even want him to?